join me in welcoming Professor Gregory Crane for a talk entitled The Humanities in a Digital Age.
Thank you. Okay. Well, I'm amazed that you're all here inside when we have one of the few incredibly beautiful days in New England. But I have to say, I beat you out. I was on Long Beach Island yesterday morning and cut short my visit to an undisclosed location where I was writing to come here to be with you today. So I'm going to, and I have a lot of, whoops, let me try. Way more slides than I'm going to get through. So you may, you may want to close your eyes if you don't want to have a seizure as some of these things go by. And so, yeah, I have a bunch of odd titles. When I first started studying classics, I thought about what it would be like to be something like the Elliott Professor of Greek at my home department. I wasn't prepared when they asked me if I would be the Winnick Chair of Technology and Entrepreneurship. But that is actually a wonderful position to be in because it essentially gives me a license to do technology, to do cool stuff, and to cause trouble, which are the two things I think I'm licensed for. And I've also been elected a humble professor of digital humanities in the computer science department for Leipzig, Germany. And in that capacity, I believe that I am there to help defend European culture against those Anglo-American. I know all of your tricks, so you can't get anything by me. And I'll start just with the question of digital humanities, and I find it tremendously ironic that I have been given a chair in digital humanities because I don't believe in the digital humanities particularly. I tend to see it as a separate niche field and as a safe place to sequester disturbing ideas. And so a friend of mine gave a lecture at a sort of important university nearby me in Boston a couple of years ago on millions of dollars of work on data mining, and the English department showed up and my friend said, "That's really cool, that's digital humanities," and they walked away and said, "That's got nothing to do with me." And probably true in the sense of what they have been doing, the practices which they have inherited, it probably doesn't fit in with that. But, so I tend to think the issue really is that ideas now flow through a digital space. We depend upon you to preserve these ideas, those of you in this case being those of you who work in the library. And when we worry, well, what happens when we lose our digital books? Well, when we lose our bank accounts and our medical records and society collapses, we'll have bigger problems to worry about. It is that the world is digital now and this civilization forever and irrevocably, I think. So the real question is, what does that mean for the humanities? It's not that the digital humanities are this little cute field over there doing their thing. It's that the world is, we swim and breathe a world of digital data. And what are the implications for that? Okay, now there are a couple of traditions I think about. And I'm really fascinated, not just because I've been offered a position in Germany, but with the German tradition of universities, which really shaped the American universities. German-American history for me doesn't begin in 1917. It begins in 1817 when Edward Everett was the first American to receive a PhD in a German university and was the first of many who came back and shaped these universities largely on the German model. And one of my heroes, Wilhelm von Humboldt, established the University of Berlin, now named after him and his brother Alexander. And his view was that the instructor is not there to serve the student there in the university. Rather, both student and instructor are there to serve Wissenschaft, which is untranslatable, knowledge, whatever. And that this is, by serving this higher goal, you advance education, and that students don't go to the university to take big lecture classes to get received wisdom. That is not worthy of a university in his view. That is somewhere else. You go there to create and to learn how to develop your own authentic voice in collaboration with others. There's another tradition that you can document. Here, for example, liberal education of the upper class is the great panacea for present and future evils. And of course, classical scholarship is still what it was, a characteristic of the higher classes in this country. And I should say in this particular book, classical scholarship is not writing books, it's being able to compose Greek and Latin verse. Because any old drudge can learn enough to write books. Germans can do that. This is very anti-German. But one has to have gone to appropriate schools and started early to be able to do Greek and Latin verse composition. Thus, it's class replication. And our universities combine both of these traditions. And obviously, one of the challenges we have, that you have at an elite institution, is to think about that. The way I think about it is my son had an opportunity to go to Tufts, where I teach, for $0. It cost nothing if we'd done it that way. And he had the bad manners of getting into another university, also a 25-minute walk from my home, that was different. So Tufts ranks about 30 if you float around somewhere there. It's a very good university. And so I'm spending $240,000 or whatever it is for him to get the name of said other university, because when at the end of his life in his obituary it'll say, educated at this particular place. Pure class formation. And I'm paying for it. That's a couple of years more work, a lot more work to retire. So where do our institutions stand with respect to these different traditions? And the other question is, where do the humanities stand? And so I have a parochial question, and I hope, and part of my purpose of coming here and talking is to help me in this. So if you have 5 years with a lot of money in the humanities and the prospect of getting a lot more money or organizing a lot more money, what would you do? Because that is kind of my situation right now. And I think the thing I want to frame for you or emphasize for you is that it's not a question. Often digital humanities are represented implicitly as ways to write more articles and books and put more stuff in JSTOR or Project Muse. Maybe that's one thing you can do. But what are your real goals? And for me, the question is how, as humanists, I interpret my goals to be how do we advance the intellectual life of humanity? You may have different goals. That's fine. This is what I interpret to be the purpose of the humanities departments. And then that might drop down to how do we help people think about the particular languages or cultures that we study. And in my case, that would be how do we get more people interacting with Greek and Latin sources in whatever capacity. And then questions, what are the metaphors that you use when you describe what our purposes are? One might be a global republic of letters, which is a very appealing one, though Eurocentric and sort of elitist. But another might be thinking in terms of a dialogue among civilizations. The UN called for a dialogue among civilizations, inspired by then Iranian President Mohammad Khatami, and that was 2001. So the UN year for the dialogue among civilizations was short-circuited in a dramatic fashion. That only means that the dialogue is more important, even though when they're storming the embassy, dialogue may not work very well. This is a long-term but fundamental process. Okay, now in terms of what we work with, we don't really work with books or even artifacts often, it's data. And often when I talk to my program officers at NSF, they'll say, don't keep giving us this text stuff. Text is easy. Give us something interesting like, pictures or movies. And I have to say, well, no, it's not quite that simple. The object, and the thing, and this is for you as a library audience, or those of you from libraries, is that the object of interest is not a book, often. For me, never. And the people I work with, never, per se. it's almost always the books, the words in the books. So if you want a catalog, and the European Digital Library, or European, has given up the catalog model altogether, and I think it's a good thing. But I need to be able to track every version, every word in every version of every source in every language over time. That's a big network. That's the object of interest that I start with. Some people go deeper into paleography, but for me, I'll settle for the word, okay? We have, say you have a million documents, 1,000 words each. You get something like you get 10, you get like, it's really a billion words here, but and if you aggregate everything, it's probably more like a trillion words of data hanging around in various formats. The HathiTrust contains 400 languages. 400 languages, so that's a lot. That's more than you can study, much less master. And we have all sorts of text-bearing objects that we have to deal with, including archaeological objects or like inscriptions and vases. We have texts in multiple languages and multiple versions over time. And we've done a very good job of creating an initial infrastructure to address intellectual or physical access. So I want to see something. And physical access is foundational. And so here's one of my favorite projects, Digital Walters, because it's Creative Commons licensed data, and they don't try to impose their own interface on it, which I think is the best way to go in both cases. And so you can go find wonderful Arabic documents, and you can get as much detail as you would want. You could read every single line, every character on that page. And if you know classical Arabic, and you understand what classical Arabic books on logic say, you're set. That's physical access. That's not intellectual access. Intellectual access is okay, now what? I've got this. And this is the great challenge and opportunity. I'll give you another example. This is the Venitas A manuscript produced in the 10th century in Constantinople and rescued or carried to Venice about a hop, skip, and a jump in front of the Turkish the final collapse. And it is the most important manuscript of Homer. It has the scholia, it has all sorts of interesting things going on with it. Not many people can read this. Not many people have access to it. The whole thing has, however, been scanned at ridiculously high resolution. And what we discovered is that now, instead of having a scholar or an expert go through and do this by hand, there are teams of undergraduate researchers at Holy Cross, which is the best classics department in the United States, best program, I should say, and Furman University in South Carolina and University of Houston collaborate in editing this. And that's kind of an impossible task, because this implies paleography, it implies knowledge and interest and energy that I assumed was not possible. When I get depressed as a classicist, which is like daily, I try to, on Friday afternoons, I will drive to Worcester and watch the Holy Cross Manuscript Club, volunteering 10 to 20 of them on Friday afternoons to work without credit and without money on publishing new manuscripts of Homer. The Homer Multi-Text Project is in some ways I think it's the most interesting project in the country with which I'm familiar, because it is so impossible. I would never believe that these students would work on this, that they might as well be flying from my perspective. And it is also an existence proof. If you can do this for this Greek manuscript, you can do it for anything, because it's really hard. Now, more generally, we face the fact, as I alluded to, that the past is hyperlingual. Multilingual is when you're Swiss and you speak a lot of languages and make everybody else feel inferior. But hyperlingual is when you just goes beyond biology, and you have to be Robbie the robot or something to even consider interacting with all these languages. The hyperlingual is when it's out of hand and you can't possibly learn all these languages. And so we now have millions of books with 400 languages. The question is, how do we get meaning out of them? How do we actually exploit that in ways that we've not been thinking about. I think we're discovering a new world, something, a little dramatic picture here, but this is an unclear picture of a map from the Marciano Library in Venice that a little more clear here. It's been flipped because it's actually got south on top. But this is a 1450-ish map of the world by Fra Mauro. And I point out that this is a coherent space before Europe realized it was encountering the New World. And it is an inconceivably large space, a space we don't really understand. We understand bits and pieces of it. We have a bunch of lampposts where we've studied what we can see, but these lampposts are very connected and very ethnocentric. And this new world is a subset of a broader intellectual perspective, and you should all be very proud. I was actually shocked. I was walking into the library today, and I looked up and I said, oh my God, that's the sort of the program that we're interested in. And you guys, Yale, whoever did this, I got to find out before I leave today when this was put together and why. This is an extraordinary thing you probably never looked at, because it contains not just the world I just showed. It starts with Native American, Egyptian hieroglyphics, cuneiform and Hebrew, Arabic and Greek, Chinese and Mayan. So it includes the New World. And, you know, and a state, they don't have Sanskrit in there, maybe I missed it, but basically the idea is they're all connected. It's not just Greek and Latin, it's everything, the whole global culture. And it's a wonderful, I mean, it's really wonderful. It cheered me up entirely today. So, you know, and this is, but to go back to this other world, it's not a static world or a made-up world. This is a map representing the travels of Marco Polo and Ibn Battuta, of whom most of you probably have never heard, but was an Arabic traveler. And when you learn Arabic in the standard textbook that is used in the United States, you discover in the first reading in volume 2 that Ibn Battuta lapped a Marco Polo and was a lot cooler than he was. And you guys never heard of him, too. So, but this represents the fact that you have networks. This is a partial representation of networks of exchange, operative in the Middle Ages and operative before that extend down into Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, into Southeast Asia, the Middle East, China, and notice like Germany, France, England really aren't part of the mainland there. They're kind of off on the backwater. But this world is a world that has a long history, and that's the world, the object of study. Not just an isolated piece, but individual pieces as parts of larger systems. And the question is, who is your audience? You know, when I grew up, I was trained to believe that my audience consisted of about 50 people in the world who would ever read anything I wrote. And they're the ones who would write for me for tenure. They would, and promotion. They would invite me to give talks and so on, and screw everybody else. And you know, that's basically the mindset that we inherited, and I believe it's a representative mindset of certainly many academic communities. And so the question is that really the audience you want? It's the only audience you could reach 30 years ago. If you write a book, it's going to go in here, or 500 places or 1,000 places like this, so why worry about it? Why not just speak in code to other people who know what you're talking about? But right now, or as of a year ago, supposedly there were 2.3 billion net users in the world. That is 1/3 of living, breathing humanity, and it is scattered all around the world. Now, do you want to write? Do you want to go write for JSTOR and Project Muse and other subscription services that have the imprimatur of your university, and to write for your academic, solely for your academic colleagues? Or do you want to reach a global audience? Do you want to do something different in the world? And you can make your own, you can sort of infer what my decision is, but by the way, I phrased that question. Now, say you wanted to go deal with a modest and Eurocentric beginning with like 8 modern and 20 historical languages. So basically, anyone speaking, those are the 6 UN languages plus German and Italian. And then below I have a number of fuzzy historical languages. And this is a starting point to that big picture. And another way of thinking about it is you might start with popular culture, the way people actually encounter the past. A much underrated movie, I have to say. I finally taught it and watched it last year. But you might start here or here. This is the Chinese Wikipedia page for Alexander the Great. And so someone's in the middle of China, and they speak Chinese, and that's what they speak. That's what they understand. They encounter this, they say, this is interesting. I would like to know more about this person, Alexander the Great. How do they do it? Where do they go? The challenge for classicists, for those of us who study the ancient world, is to design an infrastructure such that the person who speaks Hindi or Arabic or whatever, and doesn't necessarily speak English, much as French, German, and Italian, could start here and end up there in the sources. Not in your potted history, but in the data, in the sources. Now, this is a challenging topic, and so you'll not be surprised if I turn for wisdom to Homer. I've published on the Odyssey, after all, and I think, what would you find from that? It's like, it's really hard, man. This is really terrifying. So this is what I've just described isn't really, it's feasible. You could build it. You could build it up right now, but it's a lot of work, and a lot of work to do it better. The question is, where do you get the labor? Well, you have clever systems, advanced researchers, library professionals, citizen scholars, who I will not talk about today, but I'll emphasize student research and a lab culture. And this goes back to the Homer multitext. And where do you get the labor? And kids are lazy bums. They don't do anything. Here is a blog from a wonderful book called Reality is Broken by Jane McGonigal. And the guys have got a great quote. To get to level up to the top of World of Warcraft, where you're really cruising and having fun, supposedly it takes, on the average order of magnitude, 500 hours of unpaid labor to do interesting things for an artificial world. You give me those 500 hours, that's 30 weeks, that's a year of study, and 15 hours a week. You give me 500 hours of study on the craziest, hardest language you can imagine, and I'll give you a bunch of people who really know that language better than they do. They learned it when they spend 500 hours with me thinking about what they're going to have for dinner as I drone on, or as I'm asking questions around the room. How do you get this? And anyway, the amount of time people spend on games is documented elsewhere. Okay, now what resources do you have for historical languages in the US? I was shocked when I looked at the Modern Language Association's survey of who studies what languages. When I analyzed what historical languages were studied, Greek, Latin, and Hebrew, or only 11 languages have more than 50 enrollments in the country that they could track. I mean, they may be untracked, but that's the numbers they came up with. When you aggregate it, you find that Greek and Latin account for more than 75% of all historical language enrollments in the country. And when you toss in Hebrew, biblical Hebrew, you get to 95%. So all of your Sanskrit, your classical Arabic, your classical Chinese, your cuneiform languages have enrollments in the hundreds. Put another way, you drop 2 orders of magnitude, something that looks like this. This is not a curve. This is you take a bowling ball and you throw it off a building and let it crash. This is the distribution of enrollments. Now, this is not a representation of human interest, and it's a representation of this. There's a friend of mine who's a dean. So, you think you have 5 people who want to study Coptic? Can we throw a party? Call the papers? You've succeeded. You have engaged human interest in the past in a magnificent way. But this is a person allocating resources, that are scarce, and he wants bigger classes because it's not efficient for him. And this is like a pure mathematician, intellectual, not some Philistine. So now we know from like Amazon, iTunes, various other sources, this is the distribution of human interests. It's a long tail. And essentially what this means is that our universities are brick and mortar, bookstores with limited inventory. You can only put stuff on the shelf that's going to sell a certain number of units. And thus, we're not matching ourselves to what are really the interests of students. So one of the questions is, how do you get from here to something like this, where you are able to engage human interest and foster the things that people care about, which will get you, I believe, probably more engaged, more learning going on. So there's a kind of a weird dual strategy. And if you want to have this sort of global vision of the past, you have to build up your capacity to work on Greek and Latin, because that's where all your students are right now. You can't justify the enrollments. There aren't enough enrollments to pay for specialized infrastructure for classical Arabic yet. And so you have to do it, and do it in a really cosmopolitan way, not in the normal, narrow way that we tend to do it. So you have to act locally, design globally, you might say. Greek is a great place, Greek and Latin are great places to start. The Greco-Roman world, there's a whole other talk here, doesn't include much of Germany. It's not really Northern European. As my friend and colleague here at Yale, Dimitri Gutas, likes to say, the West begins at the Hindu Kush. And in fact, that is where the Greco-Roman world extends. And you have, most people in that space today speak Arabic, not European languages. Here's your thing. And so you've got to develop an infrastructure with what we might call a virtuous cycle of learning and contribution, where people aren't just typing in, fixing typos. They are learning their subjects by making contributions. And they have to make contributions because we have like 1 billion words of Latin. We have so much data in front of us, so many sources, that we would never have enough professors and librarians to do it all traditionally. You need new methods for language. Here's a tool embedded in a browser where it will replace words in your newspaper articles with Arabic or whatever language you're studying. But there are different ways of interacting with language, and I'm just going to flip through, not all of you are passionately interested in the study of Greek and Latin. I'll just say what you're looking at is are tree structures representing alternative views of a sentence, how a sentence is construed. This is what art classes has been arguing about for forever. And this is also the genome for language study. So the way, if you're doing serious linguistics nowadays, you have to go take a corpus, annotate it richly, and then analyze the patterns that come out. This is also something machines don't do very well. And in fact, and if a person can do this well, then we have pretty good preliminary evidence, not just presuppositions, that they can read the language well. So if you have a situation where students can learn the language, starting by analyzing pre-analyzed texts, and then when they get good enough, when they level up in a gaming space, and scholarship is always a game, you level up by getting a PhD, then they can start contributing. It's a very different dynamic than the one I experienced. This is just an example of a class where we looked at Greek and Arabic, and half the class knew Greek and half the class knew Arabic, and everybody worked with both texts. And I don't have time to go into that in detail. Questions of how do you keep score? And again, a lot of these contributions to scholarship also assess learning simultaneously. You kind of get both at once. You get opportunities to edit and translate the gazillions of documents that have never been translated, never will be. And these are wonderful ways of taking a medieval Latin class, for example, and saying we're not just going to give you an exam and give you something less than 100%. If you do a good job, we will publish the little translations you've done and put them in the digital library and disseminate them and make them available to a global audience for wherever long. And so we've done some work on this and distributed editing. From our perspective, we're hoping over the next year to open up every text that we serve in Perseus, in our digital library, to decentralized editing by anyone in the world who really wants to do a good job. And that includes fixing typos, adding variants, adding linguistic annotation, adding markup, doing a whole bunch of things that are really the fundamentals of digital editions, or it's the successors to print editions. But this is fundamentally a decentralized task, and everything is all up for grabs. Okay, so let's finish up here. So what are some of the implications for this? So one of the things I find really interesting, and this gets back to the question of the role of elite institutions, and is what happens, well, what's the best way of demonstrating what you've learned? And is it saying, I was group 1 at Harvard, or whatever you call it here, I was an A student at this snooty university, and these famous people wrote letters for me? What does that really mean? We all know that an A means very different things depending on, and if you're smart, you find that some people who are smart, can get A's without doing very much work. And it's kind of an imperfect metric. And there's a great deal to be said for having students focusing on creating portfolios, stuff that they present to the world to document what they have learned and what they have contributed. One of the things about NSF fellowships these days is that if you sit in a panel, I haven't been on one recently, but apparently they look at your grades and say, A, that's fine. And they look to see what research you did and to see what you contributed to your lab and what kind of project you have. How many humanists are prepared to compete in that space, given the kind of education we deliver? So an e-portfolio might contain, here are sentences of Greek analyzed in our great tree banks with students' names on them. And there are two people annotate it, and then one person checks it, and the three of them get credit. So here are the people who contributed, and ultimately you should be able to click on the names and see what they did and so on. Here is an e-portfolio for a medieval Latin class that was done with our library and a colleague of mine, where students produced translations which they showed their parents and so on in the world. Here's the Homer multi-text, where students are publishing the best data there is on the Homeric manuscripts in blogs supported by the Center for Atlantic Studies. And then finally, things like, when I was an undergraduate, we had a reading list in classics for Greek and Latin. Yale, I believe, is the last department standing here. Harvard ran up the white flag. And there's a whole thing about reading lists, but it's a way that I could talk about it. Basically, it's a way of documenting how much of a language you know. So it's an examination list, but we've never known what it meant. And so here, this documents, as you read through Greek, how many words you've encountered, how big your vocabulary is, but it's also dynamic, so you could define your own reading list. You could have students say, well, you want to learn medieval Latin? Okay, you got to give me a reading list of 100,000 words, and we'll talk about what the distribution should be. Traditionally, we couldn't examine that. We couldn't assess that efficiently. People were jammed into canonical, in a small set reading list. Now, a lot of this stuff is personalizable and customizable. Okay, so to finish up. So what are the implications for Yale and similar institutions if, or as, e-portfolios increasingly document what students have accomplished and contributed? I almost took a job at a wonderful Midwestern state school. I wish I could have taken it, but personal things kept me in the East Coast. And they were very proud of the fact that they are not East Coast elite institutions, that they deliver education in a much more egalitarian way, and in their view, a much more socially constructive way than we do at private institutions in the Northeast. And they are looking forward to challenging us, and if they have an opportunity to go beyond brand and focus on learning, that changes the world a bit. Okay, so we're really looking at, for humanists often, what seems to be a radically new and deeply traditional form of education where students are not just examination guinea pigs, getting some subset of 100%. This is actually 200 years old. It's kind of depressing and amusing at the same time. This is the Humboldt vision of university. And so I'll conclude with three questions. Make three statements. We need to ask ourselves, what are we trying to achieve? And those of you who have tenure, you can do whatever the hell you want. I mean, that's the point. But you should think about what you're trying to achieve. What do you really want to do? Is it writing books and articles and teaching people who are 18 to 21? Or teaching people to teach people who are 18 to 21? Is that your goal? It could be. That's what our goal has been. And one thing is there's just too much work for advanced researchers and library professionals. We've recovered more than 1 billion words of Latin from the first million books in the Internet Archive. The whole corpus of Latin is like 40 million words. What are we going to do with this stuff? We need people to help translate, annotate, interpret, and that's accessible to good undergraduates. And we can't depend solely upon Western voices. If you're looking at the ancient world as a system, there are not enough people, and will never be in the foreseeable future, enough people in the usual suspects, of Western universities to provide the coverage for classical Chinese, for Sanskrit, for classical Arabic. These are partnerships. And that doesn't mean you bring people here who speak English and, dress in French clothes or whatever and act like, are assimilated. This means talking to people who wear turbans in the holy city of Qom, who are not going to be westernized and are going to thank you very much, and who are very good, have a great Greek tradition. So this is a dialogue across boundaries of language and culture, and one, it's not arbitrary. It's not sort of a dreamy thing. When people storm embassies and drag ambassadors out and kill them, that's a form of dialogue. That's dialogue gone mad. The only answer to hateful speech is more speech, and it's a long-term process, like eating broccoli and not smoking. But it is an element of the health of society in a globalized world. And those of us who study the past, that ambassador was dragged out because of stuff that happened 1,000 years ago, have an urgent and constructive and tangible role to play, enabled by technology, not driven by technology. With which, thank you very much.